Hey, friends on LinkedIn. I'm Jim Collison. I'm here with Dr. Brian Brim. We want to welcome you to our LinkedIn Live. And Brian, welcome. Thanks for coming back.
Absolutely, Jim. Glad to be here.
We must not have scared you away from the first time we did this.
Nope, I decided we could get back together.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming back. We want to remind everyone listening as you're kind of checking in, we're going to give you a few minutes to check in. We want you to put your top five in the chat. If you want to do that, just type that in and hit enter, and it'll drop in our chat room. Our producer Riley behind the scenes will add those in so we can see those. And then we have a question for you. We want to know, what strengths are you leading with right now? So that's a question you can answer. Just put it in chat. We know sometimes you don't. You can do the short answer version of that. What strengths are you leading with right now? And how are you using them in a leadership role? So you can answer either one of those questions. Throw it in chat. We'll remind you of that. Brian, I want to ask you before we kind of really kick things off. What do you think right now? I mean, we've never been busier as a
Right.
leader here at Gallup. What do you think what are your themes? Don't tell us yet because we're going to record those in a second. But what
Okay.
theme do you think you're using right now?
I think I'm leaning a lot into Maximizer right now.
Mm,
So helping clients really, they're already focused on trying to do great things. And it's really, how do we take it to the next level? And how do we keep things moving in a way that helps our organization and our people be really successful? So I feel like I'm really, really using that one a lot.
yeah, I would agree with you. I have Maximizer 3. And I find myself, there's so many things happening all at once right
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
that I find that maximizer using that to help sort to
Yes, for
what's
sure.
most important, right? Or what gets to great for me, maximizer tends to come out a little bit of quantity rather than quality.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
when everything's going fast, how can I pick the best and do the most,
It
if that
does.
makes any sense, right? Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, taking it to that next level. And
Yeah.
I do think you're right. I've heard people talk about Maximizer through both the lens of quantity and quality. And I do think the sorting mechanism, the prioritization is critical. So
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
totally with you on that one.
Yeah. No, right on. If you're just joining us, we'd love to have you put your top five in chat and wherever that's at on the LinkedIn screen. I know on YouTube where that is, but on LinkedIn, wherever that is, check in. And many of you are. We want to welcome you. We'll get started here in just a second, but to continue to put your top five in chat. And then, kind of the question we're asking, what strength are you leading with right now, and how are you using them in a leadership role? Brian, as a leader, how do you does that answer change for you much when you think of maximizer? Does that change at all for you?
You betcha. I think that, kind of depends on the capacity of leadership that you're thinking about.
Mm,
So as you think about leading, I think that it's always reflecting on your strengths consistently and considering what is it that I have to accomplish, what's the outcome I'm striving for, and then what is it that I'm leaning into or need to lead into differently or more
mhm,
effectively in order to make that
mhm.
that come to light.
Love it. Love it. I don't know if you saw it, you probably didn't, but your daughter checked in, so she's out
Awesome,
there.
awesome.
She's the LinkedIn user, but that's her. And Chloe, welcome. Good to have you. I'm assuming you just have one daughter, right?
I have two.
Oh, oh yeah. Oh, could be the other one then. So sorry
I'm
if I
pretty sure it's probably Chloe.
sorry,
My other one's
sorry.
at work.
I think so. Again, check in the chat room. Let us know your top five. Um, I'm here with Dr. Brian Brim, and we're talking a little bit about leadership today. Brian, let's get started. Can you tell us your top five, and then how maybe you're using those one of those themes right now in what you're doing from a leadership perspective?
Yes, my top five are futuristic, maximizer, strategic, relator, and achiever.
And from when you think about your own leadership and what you're doing right now, how are you leaning into those themes?
Yeah, I have to say that I'm always leaning into futuristic.
Mm,
Um, because I'm always moving forward, and that's my clients are always moving forward. All my client teams are always moving forward, and by the way, our research is always moving forward. So when you think about futuristic, it's just one of those themes that I can't not be leaning into in my leadership role because it really propels us to the future. Obviously, we mentioned maximizer, and that's always about how is it that we're making the world a better place, I always, say, if you want to boil down what I do, I always say my job is to send people home better at night, right?
Mm,
And so
yeah.
maximizers, how are we creating these environments, these cultures, this world that's a better place to be a part of. And then strategic helps me think about what are the things that I need to be focusing on, what are the different approaches. Relator is big in that it's always about the partnerships. Relator always comes up every time you and I talk because we've known
Mhm.
each other for so long, and I always feel that reconnect with Jim. And then Achiever is just about now let's get it done, right? So the leadership element of Achiever for me though is how do I really support teams, support our organization, our clients, in really being productive in these times as well. So all those kind of come together all the time for me.
Mm. Brian, you talk about us knowing each other for a long time. Almost a decade ago, you and I got together and started a podcast that didn't last very long. It was we were talking about managing and in the Great Manager program that we had at the time. And in
Wow.
those days, we just silently kind of let it go. But I think as we're bringing it back, this idea of strengths based leadership for
Yeah.
folks who maybe not, I mean, I think we've got folks who've been around a while who know what that means, but maybe someone's new to this concept. What does it mean to be a strengths based leader?
One way to begin to get your head around it is we wrote a book about it a long time ago called Strengths Based Leadership. So you can dig into that, but I'm going to boil it down pretty simply for me. I think it always starts with the premise of sustainable high performance. And I think that at the heart of everything we do as an organization, that becomes an incredibly important framework. And the reason that's so important is because ultimately, creating sustainable high performance means that we as leaders are establishing leadership practices that allow us to bring out the best version of ourselves while doing the same for the people we lead. And when we do that, in addition to that, as leaders, we need to be creating these highly engaging work environments in order to enable that sustainability factor. So it's not just being high performers, because we can you can create high performance out of fear and command and control and a lot of other things. It's about doing it in a sustainable way where people really love being a part of it. They're excited to be a part of it. They feel like they're able to bring the best of themselves to the work environment every day. And I think that's ultimately all at the heart and soul of strengths
Mm.
based leadership.
I love the way you use that word sustained in that because I
Yes,
think oftentimes that's a mark, it's a metric, it's how we know we're being successful in that when that success is sustained over time, right?
right.
Um, do I have to be leading people to be a leader? In other words, do I have to have people under me or managing or whatever we call whatever those terms
Right,
we are?
right.
Do we have to have that to be a leader?
Absolutely not. I coach all sorts of leaders, and some of the leaders I coach would be, well, look at me. I would
Mm,
tell you that I don't have direct reports anymore. I led a lot of folks over my career, but in this phase of my career, I'm on a lot of different teams, matrix teams, etc., where I don't have direct reporting relationships, but I have a big influence on the people around me.
mm,
One of my goals is to always create, be on teams where we're creating positive, productive relationships, and I absolutely have a big impact on how people feel about their environment. I have a big impact on how people want to show up to our client meetings and all of those types of things, and even shaping some of the research and the future of how we're going to do work and all that. That's all leadership. So no, I think that everyone has the opportunity to lead no matter what their
mm.
position.
We have now 3 different kind of breakout reports folks can purchase additionally to their
Yeah,
all 34 report. We have a manager report, we have a sales report. We now have this new leadership report coming out here
yeah,
in the next few weeks, depending on when people are listening to this, or early November. I like to kind of call those, and you use this word, an influencer package,
yeah,
right? Managing, leading, selling, those are all
yeah.
influencing. Brian, some people have said, well, but I don't, my themes don't, I don't have in my top five, maybe a lot of influencing themes. Do I have to have influencing themes to be an influencer to have this leadership strength or
Yeah.
this? Yeah, talk a
No,
little bit about
absolutely.
that.
Yeah, absolutely not. It's kind of funny, Jim. I have a lot of leaders that I'll coach that'll say, "Well, do I have the right themes to be a leader?" Right? And if I'm feeling ornery, I might look at their report and gosh, well, gosh, no, probably not, but the bottom line is, of course you do, because it's all about leaning into the best of who you are in a way that drives the impact that you need to bring as a leader. And so simple examples I give all the time to leaders who in those domains may not have a lot of influencing themes. And then I always just ask them, how do you influence? And just let them think about it and ask them to start to unpack their strengths through that lens, no matter what domain they're sitting in. And it's a really powerful thing for them to realize. I had one recently who we were chatting, and he had a lot of strategic thinking, and he had some very specific types of relationship building themes. And I asked him, when are you at your best as an influencer? And his answer was, when I'm teaching people something.
Mhm.
And that's a great example of where he really influenced was he was a credible advisor. And that's a powerful way to influence. And that was his right way to influence. So everyone has to really think about the fact that you may not be a big salesy influencer, which is kind of what people think they should be. You need to think about how you influence because it's going to be unique for you.
Hmm. Yeah, I spend a lot of time online influencing people with the things that I do, yet I
Yeah.
don't consider myself a great salesperson because I have trouble closing. So I've
Right.
always right, I've always told people, like, if you're gonna put me in a sales role, you're gonna have to partner me with someone who's just closes like a racehorse. That I can't do that. I'm not good at it, right? But
Right.
as a leader, Brian, understanding that has put me in better positions to be able to be more effective, knowing what I can and can't do.
That's right.
As you work with leaders, how do you really get that point across, or what kind of advice do you give them about that self-awareness of knowing their own themes and then using that for their own momentum?
Yeah, I always spend a lot of time helping them start with what's the outcome you're striving
Mm,
for, because I think what happens is when leaders get confused about their strengths, it's because they're getting too caught up on style. And so they'll see someone that they see, wow, this person's they can walk into the room and light up the room, and they'll see that as the only way to influence effectively.
mhm,
And I think the real power in helping them push pause and just say, what is it what's the outcome, the critical outcome of your leadership? And get them to start there first. Because if they do, then they start to realize that, okay, if the outcome is that I just need to get people to understand something, I need to get them to buy into something or begin to believe in something, then you have to really then help them understand, now what's the most genuine way you can do that through your
mm,
strengths.
mm.
Because if you try being this other person, that's probably going to be the worst thing that you could do. So I think it starts with a really great outcome, a real clear outcome, I should say, and then working towards that through your strengths in the most genuine way
Mm.
possible.
I love that. I think in this social media age that we live in now, there's this tendency to find great leaders, find out what they're made of, and then reverse engineer their
Yeah.
success, right? And I don't know if that always is a great idea in the sense
Right.
what you just said is as leaders, we have our own unique, and we're all leaders.
Yeah.
Let's like let that cat out of the bag. We're all
Yeah.
leaders. We all lead something, right? So as leaders, we need to find our own unique. You talk a little bit about so you work somebody through their report, right? And
Yeah.
then how can they sustain that? How does that get to be a little bit more than just a moment of self-discovery? What
Mhm.
could the leaders be doing? What could all of us be doing to kind of sustain that leadership, or at least those areas of leadership we need to be we really need to move towards as we create our own unique leadership role?
Yeah, I always talk to the leaders I coach about what are those moments, and moments can be so many different things, but the way that it stays alive for them is they start to recognize those moments, and that could be a one-on-one
Mm,
conversation. It can be the way they're running a meeting. It could be the way, as we were chatting earlier, the way they're prioritizing their week. That it's all of those different moments that once they start to recognize those are switches for them to remember their strengths. And it gets them to say, I've got this conversation with Jim coming up. I need to be mindful of, and then really lean into their strengths through that lens. But it becomes less kind of not able to get your hands around it when you start to make it practical and tied to your work. And so they start to see it as being something that's very practical and tangible. And it's in those moments that I try to get them to connect those dots, that's a strengths moment. That's a strengths moment for you to be thinking about. How do I need to lean into this based on who I naturally am in order to get the best out of this situation with Jim, or get the best out of this team meeting, or whatever that case might be.
That's so great, and I think it's so super important. We're taking your questions live from chat if you want to put those in there, and we'll get to those here in just a second. If you're just joined us, you can continue to put your top 5 in chat as well. We'd love to see that as well. Riley will throw that up on the screen. So we've talked about, Brian, we've talked about ourselves as leaders and in ways we can discover self-aware and then deploy those forward, some ways to check it. What about the team? Why is it important that we know and understand the team, however that construct works? Could be a volunteer organization,
Right.
it could be a sports team of sort, it could be a, or it could be a formal team that you have at work. Why is it important that we know their strengths?
Yeah, I always start with a very simple statement, which is we all need each other. And I think that the power of the team through the lens of strengths is that it creates some really great transparency, because the strengths based language creates a positive way through which we can describe ourselves. And when we're able to start to celebrate that, we also can celebrate who we're not, which I think is incredibly freeing. That's one of the most powerful things I've seen happen on teams is when people have been able to say, I'm not the person that wants to go into the room and meet all these people I've never met before. Yet someone else is fully energized by that. And so I think that the team element of this is I say this to Jim. I think that whenever people talk about team, they think team, the whole group. And I always say, anytime you're talking about yourself and you're building your own self-awareness, that helps the team. Anytime you build a greater partnership with one other person on that team, that helps the team. And then we can continue to build on that by looking at our whole team, right? So I always encourage people to think about the individual learning that you have, the partnership interactions you have, and the holistic team perspective. All of those dynamics then create a much more robust opportunity for us to be able to truly optimize all the excellence and strengths that exists. And so it's just a super powerful thing, because it also allows people to appreciate and even recognize one another differently. They start to look at each other differently. They start to point out, wow, you do that really well. And it becomes a very, very powerful kind of culture of appreciation when you do that right, with strengths through the team lens.
Hmm. You talked about this just a second ago, but I'll bring it back up. Jennifer asked this question. She says, influencing seems to be the top strengths connected to leadership. Right? I mentioned when we think of leadership, we often think of those high in influencing. But can you talk a little bit about how strategic thinking, relationship building, and executing, the other 3 of the 4, might be tied into leadership? So as we think, Brian, I'll just ask you the questions. We think about executing, right? We
Yeah,
often think of, in that scenario, they're like, well, that's doing, that's not leading. How would you tie the executing domain, or how would you coach someone high in
I
executing?
gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and it's really a great question, that she asked. And what's quite interesting is I would tell you with like the countless leaders I've coached, I would have to say that the quote domain of influencing is not always the top theme. It's not always the top domain. And interestingly, I would tell you that that's because a lot of the leaders that are in those positions of leadership today were first and foremost really successful individual contributors. And that was often due to really high executing, right? They were the ones that were showing up and getting the work done. I think one of the most powerful things for those leaders that are, say, high executing as their, let's say, their top domain, is learning that they have to own the work differently now. That their work and the success, that the way they measure success today is very different than when they're in the individual contributor role. And so it's really ultimately going back to what I said earlier, that we have to start out with what success looks like for that leader, and then looking at, say, executing, for example, to be able to say, how is it that my achiever contributes uniquely to that success, or my responsibility, or whatever it might be in our executing domain. But it's always about putting a clear goal in mind, or a clear perspective in mind about what success looks like. And then all the rest of it just leads to that, right? And we just have to figure out which levers we're pulling effectively to get there.
Question about barrier labels, and I think interesting from that stance. Can we discuss barrier labels and how prevalent they are in our current environment and society? And leadership may be one of the last areas, don't quote me on that, is where we may come at it from a weakness perspective sometimes, right? We are trying to shore up those things that we're not good at. Can you talk a little bit about that, this idea of barrier labels in
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so barrier labels, I think, are a really important thing to understand. And leaders, it comes up all the time when I'm working with leadership teams. And what's great about the strengths-based approach is it allows them to recognize it. So they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I've been saying that Jim's stubborn, or he doesn't see things my way, and in reality, he leads with deliberative, and I lead with activator." Right? I'm making this up, obviously, but the bottom line is, it's oftentimes the real uniqueness that they bring that they've actually labeled in a barrier way, which is fascinating because they often need each other the most in those particular areas. And so I think that's the real power that I see with strengths-based leadership, is that it actually helps them pull away the cloudiness around barrier labels, and it allows them to work through that dissonance and actually say, "Oh my gosh, that's actually this theme, and now that I know that it's a theme that could be positively applied, I start to appreciate that more and differently." And so I think that's actually one of the best ways to remove those barrier labels, is to have those strengths-based conversations. And frankly, a lot of leaders have to remove those barrier labels for themselves, because they'll create their own, where a leader that tends to be more direct and straightforward may have even labeled themselves as a jerk, right? "Well, I'm just a jerk sometimes." Well, you know what? It's not that simple. Let's talk about why. Where does that come from? How does that happen? And then they start to realize, "Oh my gosh, that's really the manifestation of my themes, but it's happening in a way that's actually getting in our way of success."
Mm.
And so now they start to unpack that quote barrier label that they've created, and they start to realize they don't want to show up in that way, that it's not good for the team or the organization. And so they can work through that in a much more practical way at that point.
Mm. I think one of those hidden barrier labels we don't often say, but exist, is this idea of imposter syndrome. I am a
Yeah.
leader, but I don't belong here. Like, I don't belong in this position. I don't belong with this kind of I shouldn't have been given this kind of authority. Vince asked this question too about how should the balance look with regards to studying your strengths and your weaknesses in hopes of building the better yourself. So as we think about that studying on either side and maybe adding in those barrier labels, what is the balance there, Brian? What kind of advice do you give on that?
Yeah, and it sounds like a broken record, but I'm going to go back to, you start by clarifying what success looks like,
Mm.
and the rest of it comes into play then. So if I'm very clear about what success looks like, then as I'm coaching a leader, the conversation, whatever it is, whether it be barrier labels, whether it be leaning into your strengths in a more profound way, that just happens organically because we know what success looks like. And so the real power of those challenging leaders to really get clear about what that looks like. So if I'm coaching a leader who is getting a lot done but destroying their team, That's not success. And so we have to start by getting that right first, and then helping that leader understand that ultimately, whether they're removing barrier labels, whether they're determining how to stay kind of in that helping zone versus the hindering zone, regardless of any of that, if they're doing that work, that's all strengths based. And so it helps begin to realize that, okay, I'm leaning into to the best of myself. And that means even getting sharper about when some of my dominant themes might be pulling me off track occasionally. And so it doesn't mean that it's always a weakness. Sometimes I just need to tweak my approach in order to bring the best out of that strength for myself.
I spend a lot of time when I get in that mode where I'm thinking I'm doing this too much. I've actually started thinking, no, maybe what I'm doing is not enough for the theme. Like,
Yes.
right? It's
Yeah.
like maybe I haven't put myself in the perfect situation or created the environment in a way that totally takes advantage. I mean, if I can turn the dial to 11, and that may be a term not a lot of folks know, but if we think about a volume
Yeah.
dial that goes 1 to 10, right? 10 being really loud, ears bleeding. If I can turn that thing to 11, if yeah, that some say would they be overusing that, but if I get the opportunity to take advantage of that, right? That
Yeah.
11 volume. And so I think sometimes we come at it from, if we come at it from a different perspective of saying, no, how can I place myself in a position where 11 is valued?
Yeah.
To me, that seems like another way, right? Do you want to add anything
Yeah.
to that, Brian?
Yeah, another way I've talked about it very similarly, and you can kind of think about the old school receivers like you're talking
Yeah.
about. Sometimes it's a lack of synchronizing your strengths. So I think it's that I'm knee jerk reacting to always grab my achiever, right? But kind of like your analogy, if we think about an equalizer, right? Sometimes I need to be saying, okay, why is it that I'm over indexing on achiever? And then I stop and push pause and say, you know what? It's because I haven't leaned enough into my maximizer first. And that goes back to what we said earlier. I need to turn up the maximizer so that I'm doing a better job of prioritizing, which will then fundamentally enhance my achiever in a way to help me be really successful for this project or for my team or for what. So I'm always encouraging leaders to think about, what theme aren't you leaning into right now that you need to? What was your first reaction, and what theme do you think that was? And what theme do you need to lean into differently, or how do you need to? So I'll give you a real quick example on that one. One that comes up a lot, and it just came up in a conversation I had last week, is the theme of responsibility.
Mm.
So leaders with high responsibility, that is a theme that help them own as an individual contributor. And what they have to be very mindful of is, how am I tweaking those dials to make sure that I'm not owning things I shouldn't own,
Mhm.
and therefore taking over the job of my people? And how instead do I redefine what my leadership ownership is? And that's one of the biggest kind of ahas for leaders, to say, I need to redefine what I own, and lean into my responsibility differently, because I own involving my people. I own growing my people. I own creating a highly engaged culture. When they get there, that's a real eye opener for them. They're still leaning heavily into their responsibility. They're just leaning into it differently through the lens
Mhm.
of leadership.
We just had this conversation on another podcast about responsibility and how I felt so fortunate. Responsibilities middle for me. And so
Okay.
because I have high arranger and high, but that's not always valued.
Right.
Oftentimes, like especially in the American culture, getting things done is really, really important
Yeah.
in the American culture, right? And in younger times, I would ditch things pretty easily, right? I'd be like, "Yeah, not gonna do it." And that wasn't always valued, right? As a
Right.
firefighter, though, and I think of myself of that and with this arranger, kind of
Yeah.
maximizer, activator, different every day, and letting go of responsibility to say, "Look, I'm gonna trust others to have that follow-up and follow-through. You can always have me on the tip of the spear where every day is different. Where I'm fighting, I'm putting out fires every day." And letting go of that was
That's
also
right.
freeing, right? To be able to say, "Yeah, no, it's not that I don't wanna be responsible, it's just not what I'm best at. Put me on the tip of the spear, right? Put me
Yeah.
out front."
And
Yeah.
guess what? You get a lot of stuff done.
We do. We produce a lot of things. And in the final few minutes, and actually we just have 1 minute, Brian, as you think, if you were going to encourage leaders today from a strength-based perspective, what kind of encouragement would you give them as we kind of wrap this up?
Real simple. Play your weekly highlight reels. Have your strengths in front of you. Friday morning, pour your cup of coffee or tea, review your week, and think about, where did I do well? Where did I struggle? What could I have done differently through my strengths in order to impact my world in a positive, productive way?
I love that. I mean, oftentimes on Monday, football is a big deal in the United States on Sundays. I watch all the highlight reels.
Yep.
Why don't we do that for in the week? Like, I love that. Friday, go back. Hey, what went well? What did I do right?
Absolutely.
Brian, thanks for coming on and being a part of this. Always great to be with you. I wish we had more time, and we do, but for others, we're going to limit it to the 30 minutes that we have. So, Brian, thanks for coming out. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Jim.
Couple reminders just before I go. One, Christian had asked, can you share the where and when the transcript will be uploaded? So it's available right now with automatic transcripts on LinkedIn. So if you're just on LinkedIn on the Clifton Strengths page and you haven't followed us on the Clifton Strengths page, you should do that right now. So get that done before you go. It's available. We'll, in a couple weeks, we'll do some post-production and create some a page for this with transcripts, and we'll post it to the new Clifton Strengths podcast. And Riley, I don't know how long we can call it new, but I'm going to go with it. The new Clifton Strengths podcast. If you haven't subscribed to that yet, just on any podcast app, just search Clifton Strengths and you'll find it there. And we have a weekly encouragement for you every single week of the year. And you can come out and listen to those episodes as well. We want to thank you for joining us live. Thanks for coming out on LinkedIn. We got plenty more of these available. Like I said, follow us on the Clifton Strengths page so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for coming out today. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.